どうも、日本語のサムです。Today it's time to talk about one of the most common things we do in everyday life, introducing yourself. You might be aware that Japanese has different levels of formality depending on the situation, so I'll be sure to introduce you to some useful keigo too. では、始めましょう。はじめまして。はじめまして。This is a very common phrase in Japan that's used when we first meet someone. It actually derives from the more formal お目にかかります. At first, this looks like it's saying, this is the first time for me to see you, but actually it's just a keigo way of saying 会う or to meet. So really we're just saying, it's the first time to meet you. Anyway, just remember, はじめまして is the go-to phrase the first time you meet someone. サムです。私はサミュエル・スターリングと申します。A common phrase to introduce yourself. Obviously, you should replace my name with yours. It's common just to use the Japanese version of be, des, when we talk about ourselves, but we also often use variations of the verb you to talk about what someone or something is called. And the most formal version of this is the keigo 申します. One thing people get hung up on sometimes is just how much of your name to share when you introduce yourself. Of course, in a casual situation, like when a friend is introducing you to another friend, you can just use your first name. But in a business situation, that's not really appropriate, so it's best to use your full name, or even just your family name. Of course, in Japanese, the family name comes first, but when you introduce yourself as a foreigner, it's best just to use the same order that you would use when talking to someone else of your own language. So I would say Samuel Starling, not Starling Samuel. よろしくお願いします。よろしくお願いします。This is another well-known Japanese phrase, and one that is notorious for being incredibly difficult to translate into other languages. That's because rather than the words themselves having a concrete meaning, it's more about trying to express a kind of feeling, and it really shows the earnestness of Japanese people. Basically, we're asking the other person for their kindness and respect in our forthcoming relationship. When we think about this in English, it's basically just an extension of nice to meet you, but in Japan it's very important to use both. In a formal situation, we change お願いします to お願いいたします, while in a more casual situation, just よろしく is fine. なんて呼んでいい？なんと呼んでいいですか？なんて呼んでいい？なんと呼んでいいですか？ This is a useful phrase for asking someone's name, but it can also be used after you hear someone's name to decide the best way to call them. For example, by their first name, their family name, or some kind of nickname. In Japan, it's polite to give your name first, so you might use it something like this. はじめまして、サム・スターリングと言います。なんて呼んでいいですか？サムと呼んで、サムと呼んでください。サムと呼んで、サムと呼んでください。As you might expect, this is an answer to the previous question, or just a way to make clear how someone should call you. はじめまして、サミュエル・スターリングと言います。サムと呼んでください。出身はどこ？ご出身はどちらですか？出身はどこ？ご出身はどちらですか？出身 refers to your hometown or place of birth, and どこ is the question word for where. In a more polite situation, we can change どこ to どちら. There's also another variation, which is どちらのご出身ですか? The meaning is basically the same, but I thought I'd share it with you anyway. It's also common to add a kind of honorific marker, o or go, to the start of some nouns when we speak more politely in keigo, but I won't get into that in this video. 出身は〇〇です。出身は〇〇です。This literally reads as my hometown is, but obviously I'm from is a more natural production in English. Japanese people usually say what prefecture they're from, but as a foreigner it's probably best to say which country you're from. If you want to say both, the correct order is country and then city. For example, 出身はイギリスのケンブリッジです。In the last section, I talked about how we can add ご to 出身 to make it more formal. But we don't use this when we talk about ourselves because it's a kind of honorific form, so please be careful. どこに住んでいるの？どちらにお住まいですか？どこに住んでいるの？どちらにお住まいですか？ This question is just like the English, but we use the continuous form of 住む. And like before, to make it more polite, we can change どこ to どちら. To go one step further, we can use the noun form お住まい, which literally refers to the place where you live. 〇〇に住んでいるよ。〇〇に住んでいます。〇〇に住んでいるよ。〇〇に住んでいます。Like before, we use the continuous form 住んでいる to talk about where you're living right now. In Japan, it's common to state your prefecture or city, or maybe in a local setting, the district where you live. But of course, it's up to you to decide how much personal information you want to share. Japanese addresses go in the opposite order to English, so we start with the largest location. So, for example, in my case, I would say 神奈川県小田原市に住んでいます。どのぐらい住んでいる？どのぐらいお住まいですか？どのぐらい住んでいる？どのぐらいお住まいですか？どのぐらい is the Japanese equivalent of how long when talking about time. So you can use this question to ask how long someone's been living somewhere. Especially for foreigners, it's common to be asked how long we've lived in Japan. And that sounds something like this. どのぐらい日本に住んでますか? Another variation is 日本に来てどのぐらい in which 日本に来て refers to the time since you've come to Japan. 〇〇住んでいるよ。〇〇住んでいます。〇〇住んでいるよ。〇〇住んでいます。Here you can use any number of time phrases to describe your situation. A couple of points to note. Firstly, this time there is no ni because we're not talking about a place. And secondly, we don't use the polite form お住まい to talk about ourselves, so be careful. Here are some useful time phrases that you could use here. The first is 3ヶ月. ヶ月 is the counter for months, so you can change 3 to any number of your choice. For years, you can use 3年間, or for weeks, 3週間, if you've only recently moved. Another useful phrase is 半年, which literally means half a year, so it's a smart way to say 6 months. 休みの日は何してるの？休日は何をしていますか？休みの日は何してるの？休日は何をしていますか？休み is literally a holiday, but it's commonly used to refer to a day off work or school. You can also add some phrases like 普段 or いつも to add the nuance of usually. For example, 休みの日いつも何してんの？何々してるよ。何々しています。何々してるよ。何々しています。We previously learned that the continuous form of the verb is used in the same way as English, i.e. to talk about something that's currently in progress. However, in Japanese, we can also use it to talk about habits, unlike in English, where we only use the present simple. Here's an example. 休みの日、何してるの？日本語を勉強してるよ。何々して過ごしてるよ。何々して過ごしています。何々して過ごしてるよ。何々して過ごしています。Another variation is to use the verb 過ごす, which means to spend time. You compare this with a verb or noun referring to an activity for the same effect as the English gerund. 休みの日何してるの？最近は映画見て過ごしています。趣味は何？趣味は何ですか？趣味は何？趣味は何ですか？趣味 is the Japanese word for hobby. It's not too unusual to hear this in English, but there is another more interesting variation. 趣味はありますか? This is literally asking if you have any hobbies. I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't. 趣味は〇〇だよ。趣味は〇〇です。趣味は〇〇だよ。趣味は〇〇です。While this is a slightly formal way to speak in English, it's perfectly fine to use this in Japanese. Of course, if you're responding directly to a question, you can just add des to the noun or gerund of your choice. Now let's put some of today's lesson into practice.
はじめまして、八木下です。
どうも、はじめまして、サムと言います。
俺は普段みんなからヤギって呼ばれてるから、ヤギって呼んで。
わかった。よろしくね、ヤギ。僕のことサムって呼んでね。
サムね、よろしく。サムはどこに住んでるの？
神奈川県の小田原って場所だよ。
小田原か、俺も小田原に住んでるんだよ。
へ
サムは日本に来てどれぐらい住んでるの？
もう6年ぐらいかな。
6年か、だからそんなに日本語上手なんだね。
そんなことないですよ。
もともとなんで日本に来たの？
昔から日本の音楽が好きでね。
音楽か。普段休みの日は何してるの？
最近はゲームをして過ごしてることが多いかな。ヤギは？
俺は普段サイクリングしたりランニングしたり友達と一緒に過ごすことが多いかな。
そうなんだ。趣味はありますか？
特別な趣味はないかな。まあでも昔から漫画が好きでよく読んでるよ。
漫画ね。最近日本で鬼滅の刃ってやつが人気だね。
あ、そうなんだよ。俺も昔から好きでさ、もしよかったら今度映画行かない？
映画か。行こうよ。
ああ、いいね。じゃあまた連絡するよ。
Bye. Okay. That's all for today, but if you found this video useful, then please hit that like button and subscribe for more easy to understand Japanese every Friday. If you have any questions about today's lesson, leave them in the comments down below and I'll try to get back to you or cover it in a future video. では、また来週。